Oh, hell, Internet. This section is about socialism, but we need to start with communism. And I want to say unambiguously at the start that communism does not work for humans, for reasons we will touch against. But the hysterical bias towards the concept is not based on this fact. It is based purely on the historical traumas of the 20th century and the tragedies that happened, of course. Now, in the limiting case of communism, we talked about the limiting and absurd case of capitalism. The limiting case of communism, equally absurd, is that all resources are distributed evenly over all members of a population for all time. Now, that is clearly ridiculous, but even if we take, a real-world angle on that general idea, anything that you could reasonably call communism in terms of resource distribution is going to be outside what is optimal for the flourishing of human civilization as I understand it. More tellingly, though, no system has ever really been introduced to bring about this philosophical limit, and we'll come back to this at the end, but all states that have ever existed have been ruled by a tiny minority of their population, and no matter what policies they might try and enact, at that point you've lost communism. The only way to effectively apply communism to humans, like I say, still disagree, would be some kind of automated system which just calculates everything and uses the data, according to the patterns. All communist and socialist states have been operating with extremely limited data and a very small energy budget compared to what would be necessary. They failed because they failed to understand the transition to a mass society properly, and in some ways that was through no fault of their own, but the tragedies that resulted were due to something that happened before the idea of communism. They go back to the old way of thinking, the divine right monotheistic way of thinking, in the West at any rate, and that is the cult of personality. There are always opportunists who are prepared to make use of an ideology in order to rise to power. And some of them may even have good intentions to start, but the cult did the rest, by hook or by crook, emphasis on the crook. And all of the dictators were like this. So don't tell me that Stalin or Mao were any different because they were communist dictators. No, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. That's dictatorship. And I still don't think communism works. It doesn't appreciate the uniqueness of the individual, and it doesn't take into account things like the Pareto principle, which, suggests that there is some kind of natural imbalance that creates dynamism in a system. But let's have that discussion instead of all the manipulative scaremongering that we see in any discussion of general political ideas today. And so we come to socialism. For someone like Marx, socialism was a step towards communism, which he still thought was possible, by ensuring mutual ownership of productivity. Note, this is very different from equal distribution of resources. But like I said last time, Marx was still thinking in a zero-sum mindset. We do not need to make class struggle an adversarial relationship. We can develop some kind of responsible market model. This does not preclude a certain amount of socialism. But how much socialism? How does that work? There are so many different models, from futuristic ones where you can actually try and, calculate an individual employee's stake in a corporation and allow them to receive dividends based on how the corporation performs, to models which are working in the world today, like the Nordic countries, who have a decent social safety net, free healthcare, and whose citizens rank as consistently among the happiest in the world. We can have those discussions too, but already we can see that there's a huge straw man in any of these Wilt Chamberlain objections to socialism. And if you're not clear, Wilt Chamberlain was this idea of a basketball player, and everyone is happy to pay 25 cents extra to see Wilt Chamberlain. He's that famous, he's that popular. Who is anyone, the government or whoever, to say that Wilt Chamberlain has to give back that money that everyone has freely given, knowing that it's going directly to him? In huge numbers of socialist models, Wilt Chamberlain will be just fucking fine. And he will be more secure in his wealth and not less, and the masses will have more money to spend on his t-shirts, giving him even more money. Now, even if his ultimate numerical wealth would be perhaps lower, depending on how the whole system balances out, his functional opportunity would be exactly the same compared to somebody who just has to come and pay for the cheap seats at one of his basketball games. But even beyond these basic ideas of fairness, the modern mass society has changed the idea of resource ownership from any historical norms that we know. It is not simply tied to your personal productivity in the modern world anymore, because increasingly there are those at the bottom who are actually unable to do any cost-effective productive work under the current system, and yes, those at the top who receive resources far beyond any idea of productive work they could conceivably have done. Yes, a good idea is a good idea, and the vision to drive that forward encourages huge rewards. And like I've said before, the idea of a billionaire, single billionaire, does not seem abhorrent to me in the modern mass society. But the idea of billionaires who just basically race to see how many billions that they can continue to amass does. You're not royalty, We're supposed to be past the age of the divine right of kings. And this is why I am left-wing. Free healthcare, education, housing, and food at a base level is the minimum that we can provide to all people. And it would in no way affect the dominance of the great innovators and the corporate monopolies who would still control the massive majority of the world's wealth. But the biggest straw man of socialism, which I've already alluded to, is that it has been tried and it's been shown to be ineffective. I've already mentioned the Nordic models. Those are socialist success stories, pure and simple. But further than that, the industrial age of Earth was, past tense, one single historical context. And all the individual experiments failed in that context as a result of some of the baggage from the old tribal world, notably the cult of personality. All dictators became so because of this cult of personality, nothing to do with the broader ideologies. Even though early socialism misunderstood the nature of the modern mass society, and there were many mistakes made from that, the tragedies of the 20th century cannot be ascribed to directly socialism or even communism. They can be ascribed to the cult of personality. Even the way the right disingenuously attacks socialism is proof of this. All this talk of Marxist or Maoist threats. Those two guys were just guys. Clearly, each of them was one of those individuals who created a larger cultural eddy in the river of history. But now they're dead, and it is for us to decide where we stand in relation to their ideas. And the ideas of Marx are not some pseudo-religious principles, although they can be applied as such if you choose to submit to a single person's unchanging view of how history works. But the writing off of socialism, or even communism, or even capitalism as just a fundamentally, functionally bad idea just demonstrates a lack of imagination, I think. Because obviously, for any given civilization at time t in its development, the optimal system from a wealth distribution point of view is going to be some synthesis of the two. Marx had an interesting derivation of Hegel's materialism in the political context. He was wrong to generalize class struggle as an adversarial force in the abstract. If I'm going to take an even more abstract view, you can say that, okay, for any single individual operating at a certain point of view within a political space, you will view the opposition in some kind of adversarial sense. That is how it works when you are occupying a point in space relative to another point in a space. However, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, and any one specific perspective is clearly not the universal perspective. To really see a pattern beyond the chaos, as it were, you must not be looking from any perspective within the system, which of course no individual or mass individual can truly do.